I want to turn our attention now to Biden's abandonment of Israel. As the tribulation approaches, Satan will continue to maneuver events, making Israel more vulnerable. This is a study that you need to kind of grapple with and get settled on. It appears one of Satan's chief purposes for installing the Biden administration is to come against Israel. Ever since President Obama, Satan has been waiting and scheming for another shot at Israel. How many of you remember how anti-Israel Obama was? Well, if you want to know why there was such a push to install mentally deficient Joe Biden, I believe it was to install Satan's puppet government to implement his anti-Israel strategy. Now, we've been talking about this for years, how that as we get close to the tribulation, America is going to have to be less stronger. It's going to lose its superpower capacity somehow. Maybe when the rapture comes, it's going to hurt America. Maybe there'll be a financial collapse that'll hurt America. But what's happening in front of our very eyes is the tide is changing and America is shifting away from Israel, which is very, very dangerous. What's at stake here, folks, if I could put that next slide up, Scott, what's at stake here, folks, is the ultimate goal of dividing Israel. Now, if you'll look up there at that slide, you'll see those mountainous region is the West Bank. You all see that? That's the high mountains where Jerusalem is. And if you see that dotted line running all up and down there, you see that? That dotted line is precisely what Joe Biden just announced belongs to the Palestinian state. He calls it the U.S. Palestinian reset. So I'm going to read something to you, so hopefully it'll help you a little bit. You know that one of the Abraham Accord nations is the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. Last week, the United Arab Emirates daily newspaper called The National published the content of a U.S. internal State Department document that describes the new policies of the Biden administration that he intends to adopt towards Israel and the Palestinians. Titled, The U.S. Palestinian Reset and the Path Forward, the memo was written by Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Israeli and Palestinian Affairs, Hadi Amir. I'm going to talk about Hadi in a minute. Amir has a long history of hostility towards Israel and the support of the Palestinian terrorism. He says, quote, "We shouldn't be shocked when our military assistance to Israel after 9/11, Hadi Amir, who's now just about the top dog at the State Department, at 9/11, after they attacked New York City, Amir's comments was, we shouldn't be shocked when our military assistance to Israel and our UN Security Council vetoes that keep on protecting Israel come back to haunt us. Mir, who has accused Israel of apartheid, has frequently advocated for U.S. engagement with the Hamas terror group and for a three-way deal with Hamas, the PLO, and Israel. According to the report in the UAE, the new administration intends to cancel the Trump administration's policy regarding Israeli exports to the U.S. That policy determined that Jewish-owned businesses in the West Bank would be marked as made in Israel. Thank you, President Trump. Now that policy will be reversed because Team Biden believes the West Bank belongs to the Palestinians. The new administration intends to reinstate financial support for UNRWA, the UN Relief Works agency that is corrupt to the hilt that President Trump pulled support from, and the Palestinian Authority. The memo also makes clear that the Biden administration will reinstate the Obama administration's policy of preserving Israel or pressuring Israel to withdraw to the 1949 armistice lines, which are those dotted lines in front of you. You can go to that next slide, Scott. As to the Abraham Accords, the Biden administration intends to subvert the accords in a way that will indirectly reinstate the PLO's veto over Arab-Israeli ties. That's a long way of saying that there's an about-face and Israel's in trouble. God says, don't divide the land, and when they divide the land, that triggers the tribulation period. So we ought to expect there's more and more pressure from the surrounding countries, Zechariah 12, to want to change the borders of Israel. And Zechariah says, when you mess with the borders of Israel, you're going to get a hernia and you're going to get hurt. And that's precisely what now we're seeing. I should ask this question, to whom was the promised land promised? Right? So find me Obama 3.0, Scott, as Joe Biden slips into the state of dementia, who is running the country? Now, you have in your notes, in your packet, 4 sheets on Biden's hostile to Israel appointments. You really should pull them out. They're the colored sheets, 4 sheets in your packet, Biden's hostile to Israel appointments. While you're getting them, I'll just say it looks like the queen of the White House is Susan Rice, Obama's former head of the National Security Agency. She is now the entire director of domestic policy of America, and she is appointed by Biden, is in the White House, and she knows how to maneuver around. Seems to me she's now in charge of coordinating the third Obama term with the other team members, Harris, Michelle, and Valerie Jarrett. Even if Harris replaces Biden, it will be meaningless. Not a thing will change. She will still be subservient in the role of what's going on. I'm convinced that was the deal that she gave, and that was the deal she accepted. Our country, in a third term of Barack Obama, has gone from making America great again to let's harm America again. He laid the foundations for our immoral policies that we're reaping, for saying we're no longer a Christian nation. He was the first president to turn against Israel, the first president to favor Iran, the first president to favor Islam and the Quran over Christianity in the Bible. The first one that tried to remove Netanyahu in office in 2015, they started V15 in Tel Aviv, got on the internet, and his whole team that helped him win the 2008 and 12 election went to Israel and put on this massive social media campaign to get Netanyahu thrown out. And Netanyahu had his best victory so far. By the way, the election is today in Israel, and I was on a call a couple hours ago from a gentleman in Israel, and Netanyahu's like he always is. You need 61, and he's got 60 or 61. So it's hard to say. It's still a little bit too early to tell. Now we've got a whole new administration that's criminally changing the voting system, letting tens of thousands of illegals in. It's not looking good. The slide says the new administration is packed with anti-Israel appointments and anti-Israel policymakers to align with the end-time causes of Satan against Israel. Biden's senior appointments, there's no way Joe did these senior appointments. Now let me explain to you what's going on. For the cabinet appointments, they need congressional approval. But when you start to come to second tier, third tier, and fourth tier and fifth tier, it doesn't. Well, Obama's intelligent enough to know that he wanted to stack those people as radicals and anti-Semites. I could be here for hours unpacking the depth of just the State Department's new appointments that are looking to take Israel out, which we'll show you shortly here. First of all, let me go back to Obama. This was, you remember this? No, go back where you just were, Scott. Yeah. This is the Iranian team that John Kerry put together. Can you see the guy with the bald head behind John Kerry? He is now Bob Mallory. He's on your list. I believe he's in your the papers that I gave you. That's him there. He's now the head of Biden's Iran policy. And then to the left of him is Wendy Sherman on the Iranian. Is the Iranian deal the worst deal in the history of mankind? Yeah. They got together and said, okay, we're protecting everybody, and they gave them a couple years to have their nuclear weapons. That's Wendy Sherman. She's now Deputy Secretary of State. She ran the organization that failed miserably in negotiating that peace deal that we had to pay billions of dollars to bribe them to get into, which wasn't a deal. It wasn't even a treaty. We never signed it, and Iran claims they never even signed it. And the next one, Team 2, if you would. Avril Haines, I've talked to you about her. She is now National Intelligence Director. For the last 4 years, she has run Obama's foundation at Columbia University, one of the biggest, brightest, most anti-Semitic university schools in America. She's been running Obama's, Avril has, to go out around the world and find bright people and bring them back to America. That's what she's been doing for. She's now head of National Intelligence Director. Hang on. On the next page, this is Rima Doden, Uzra Zala. Rima Doden is another State Department. By the way, do you know how many people work in the United States State Department? Everybody say a lot. 69,000. So when Trump began to complain about the deep state, that's just one agency. One agency. You have no control over those people, what's going on. But Rima Babes here, she's another anti-Semitic pick. Deputy Director of the White House Office of Legislative Affairs. In 2002, when suicide bombers killed 30 Israelis at a cafe in Israel, Doden expressed her deep sympathy for all the people who had to become desperate enough to become suicide bombers. She recently addressed a church audience in Loma, California, spreading the gospel of Palestinianism. And she said that the Palestinian suicide bombers were the last resort of desperate people. Not one word in the last 20 years of all those Israelis that got killed, but a lot of pain and sympathy for the poor Palestinian bombers. She is now in the government as a high-standing deputy director of White House Legislative Affairs. Everything the White House is going to bring up to the Congress, she's the head of. You don't have to be good at anything in this new administration. You have to do two things: be radical at something and hate Israel. Uzra Zala is the State Department's undersecretary, get this, for civilian security, democracy, and human rights. The only problem with putting her in charge of human rights is she supports Hamas and the PLO. You know, they have no human rights for women whatsoever, or Christianity. She's in charge of human rights. Then there's Christine Clark, another anti-Semitic. She's the lead of the Justice Department's Civil Rights Division. She had to apologize last month for when she hosted an event with an anti-Semitic professor at Harvard University. The professor at Harvard she invited was Tony Martin to speak at the event where he attacked the Jewish people for their tradition of targeting blacks. So here Biden has picked a black radical anti-Semite to lead America's Civil Rights Division. And then there's Ariana Tabatabai. You say it. Another anti-Semite. Ladies and gentlemen, she is the senior advisor to the Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. She's an Iranian Muslim. Her father still teaches at the University of Tehran and is an active consultant to the Iranian regime, making her Biden's direct connection to the Ayatollah. Then there's Hadi Amir. We talked about Haiti before. Another anti-Semitic. Deputy Assistant Secretary of the State for Israel-Palestine. This is the envoy for the Palestinian-Israeli process. Another Beirut-born Arab American, grew up in Saudi Arabia. The former director of Al Gore's presidential campaign. I know you're feeling good about this guy already. A history of deep hostility towards Israel. He was the national coordinator of what's called the anti-Israel Middle East Justice Network. And his famous quote is, "I've been inspired by the Palestinian Intifada." The Intifada was when the Arabs really started killing Jews. That inspired Hadi Amir. He was inspired by the Arabs rising up and being able to kill a bunch of Jews. Don't you feel good that he's in charge of the Israel-Palestinian peace process now? He wants $75 million immediately to send to Gaza. And Biden puts Amir, known for his radical anti-Israel views, with ties to the Palestinians and Hamas, he puts him in the key position as the point man for negotiating the Israeli-Palestinian policy. You can rest assured Netanyahu knows exactly and precisely what's happening. Then there's Colin Kahl, another anti-Semitic pit, over the Pentagon. He's the Undersecretary of Defense Policy. He's so radical that CUFI, Christians United for Israel, are currently, as we speak, doing a massive campaign in West Virginia to try to get the Democratic congressman in West Virginia to vote no to this guy. He supports undoing, calling the Iranian Revolutionary Guards a terrorist organization. He doesn't want to do that. But I saved the best till last, a guy by the name of Bahir Bitar. Bahir Bitar is a Palestinian American, and he is now the senior director of the programs of national security. He was Adam Schiff's top legal advisor and orchestrated the impeachment against Trump. He holds a deep animus for Israel. Bitar is responsible, get this, Bitar is solely responsible for the president's daily intelligence briefing. He gets to decide single-handedly what information the president knows and what information he doesn't want him to know. Meaning he knows the secrets we will share with Israel and what secrets we won't want to share with Israel. That means he gets to order the U.S. intelligence community what its priorities are for intelligence gathering. Bitar was the executive head of a member of Students for Justice in Palestine. It was a Palestinian solidarity movement whose conferences on the campus had a history of anti-Semitism supporting Hamas and the murder of Jews. Bitar was one of the principal organizers of this hate group at Georgetown University called Students for Justice in Palestine. One of his more sinister tactics was to promote BDS and anti-Israel activities to Christian evangelical communities, to get churches and evangelicals to stop supporting Israel. He taught how to talk to evangelicals and how evangelicals can talk to Jewish people to win support. He earned his degree, get this, in forced migration studies, focusing on Nakba. Nakba is the day that Israel was founded. And it's a national holiday in the Muslim world. All over the world, the whole world, that's a quarter of the earth celebrates Nakba Day. The worst thing that ever happened when Israel became a nation. His doctorate or his degree was on Nakba Day. He focused on how to reverse the damage of the Jewish state by causing the right of return of Palestinians to produce a majority of population of them in Israel. Then he went to work at the UN at the corrupt UNRWA pro-Palestinian office in Jerusalem. And that's how he got Obama's attention, who doesn't believe that Israel has the right to be there. So folks, the top senior director of intelligence, who's supposed to be an intelligence official, is an anti-Israel activist who hosted conferences with speakers that support Islamic terrorism and who held sessions on how to describe how best to demonize Israel. Biden puts this guy in charge of national security intelligence. I would say Bitar would be best viewed as a satanic plant, because now Israel can't share with us what they know. And this administration will never share with Israel what they know. So what's happened is Satan has put a real wedge in the relationship between the Jewish state and America for the first time in 73 years. He has successfully wedged our relationship in this key intelligence role. We can assume Bitar will try to limit the collaboration that Israel has with America and will distort it. And this will make Israel more vulnerable and will bring God's wrath and anger down on America. How many of you can see God's judgment on America beginning to flow? Allowing an anti-Israel government to be put in place is not good. Now, you've got a little card in your folder. It's time for another saying. You need to relax now. Get your card out and you have another saying. All right, remember our last saying? God's sovereignty is my... All right, we got a new one for you. Just humor me. Now, some of you are falling asleep. Now, come on. I'm going to make you stand up again and start talking while you're standing. I'm going to make you to talk. I'll start talking while you're standing. All right, you ready? You got your pens and your card ready? Let me see. Put your cards up. I want to see. All right, here you go. Ready? It's not about the man. It's about God's plan. It's not about the man. It's about God's plan. Can I get a witness? Hallelujah. Amen. Oh, and then we have Betty McCallum. She now controls Congress's defense spending. She's the chair of the defense spending of House Appropriations Committee. Are you surprised that she supports cutting military aid to Israel? Here's what she says. She says, U.S. tax dollars in the form of military aid to Israel have been permitted in the past to sustain what is clearly a gross human rights violation against children. Betty rules all future U.S. defense spending proposals. And she put in the record, the congressional record, when they were questioning her, she said this, quote, "The violence used by Israeli against Palestinians, especially children, is shocking and abhorrent, and we should cut money to Israel." So it's not just in the intelligence community, it's in the Pentagon, and it's in the finances. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll draw a few conclusions as I round second. Conclusion number one, America needs Israel more than Israel needs America. We're turning against Israel, which puts us in violation of the law of God's foreign policy. How many of you know what the law of God's foreign policy is? It's in Genesis chapter 12. It's called the Abrahamic Covenant. And the law is real simple. I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. We have stood with Israel for 73 years. But if the tribulation is coming close, it doesn't surprise me that all of a sudden we're shifting to no longer support Israel. We were the only one, I love to talk about this, we were the only one that stood with Israel on May the 14th, 1948. Everyone in the country said to Truman, "Don't recognize the Jewish state." Is there any coincidences with God that the only superpower on earth was the only one that stood with Israel? And that since 1948, we have been the sole one, like a big brother, like the scaffolding. As Israel kept getting a little stronger, we stood. We wiped out the Ottomans in World War I. We wiped out the Nazis in World War II. We helped Israel after it was born. And now we're stayed with them and stayed with them. We gave them the fight. They've been like the 51st state of the United States. Now our government says we got to cut support to those radicals. They're a bunch of cutthroats. The times are changing. I'm going to go 2 slides ahead this time, Scott. Number 3, in closing on this section, with such an anti-Israel campaign kicking in, listen, folks, with such an anti-Israel campaign kicking in, you can count on the church having a target on its back. Why will the church have a target on its back? Let me ask you a question. Who is the single largest pro-Israel support group on earth? The single largest support group in the world are evangelical, born-again, pro-Israel Christians. If you'd go to Israel, you'd recognize it. Thousands and thousands of buses every day running up and down Israel from China and Europe and from Africa, filled with Christians supporting Israel. If this campaign that I've tried to describe is so sophisticated and deep that they're implanting, I know they know what they're doing. We don't quite know what they're doing, but they've turned the government around against Israel. You can rest assured somewhere in this program is a target on your back and my back. Because we support Israel. Is there any wonder why there is a COVID attack on the church? Now, this all leads me to talk about one more piece of the puzzle that's coming up next. That is the empire of Antichrist.